The nation's eyes will be on the polls in Virginia and New Jersey next week. Voters go to elect their new governors, and the results of these races are expected to predict next year's midterm congressional election.
And after the 2020 presidential election, both parties called for major voting reform legislation. So what would that look like? Drastically different for Democrats than for Republicans. Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson explains.
While both Republicans and Democrats have made election integrity a major part of their platform in state and federal races, the parties are taking very different approaches toward reform.
It's ludicrous for any Republican to assert that the federal government has no role to play in safeguarding elections.
Democrats recently failed to advance the Freedom to Vote Act in the Senate. The measure would expand early and mail-in voting, allow for automatic and same-day voter registration, ease ID requirements, and prevent what they call voter suppression.
It would put in all kinds of very bad provisions that would make elections more insecure and really cause problems in future elections.
Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation argues that voter suppression isn't a problem.
That is evidenced by the fact that, for example, in the last election last year, we had the highest turnout in an election since 1992, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So the idea that there's voter suppression going on is just belied by the evidence.
States under GOP control, like Texas and Georgia, are passing bills that include ID requirements for absentee ballots, revised times for early voting, and bans unsolicited requests for mail-in ballots.
The best way to inspire confidence is to fix the vulnerabilities that currently exist. And that's what a number of states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, and others, they've passed election reform bills to actually try to fix some of those problems.
Spakovsky tells CBN News states should also conduct audits after elections.
The whole point of an audit is not to overturn a prior election, but to make sure that all the laws and regulations were followed, that everyone was able to vote who was eligible to vote, that the equipment all worked the way it should.
With former President Trump doubling down on claims of widespread voter fraud in 2020, the question remains how that might affect turnout in close statewide governor races like New Jersey and Virginia.
If voters believe that the system is rigged and their vote isn't going to count, then that's certainly a disincentive to vote.
Inside Elections' Nathan Gonzalez told CBN News despite those claims, he believes voters from both parties will show up at the polls.
I think in the case of Virginia, Republicans are anxious to send a message to President Joe Biden and the Democrats, and I think that any concerns about the system will be overcome with enthusiasm to send a message.
Gonzalez believes no matter who wins these upcoming races, claims of fraud or vote rigging by the party that loses are likely to follow. Reporting from Virginia, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Well, CBN chief political analyst David Brody joins us from our Washington bureau to tell us more on this. David, let me take you all the way back to 2000 and the famous hanging chads of Florida. In the aftermath of that, Florida passed a lot of election reforms. This past election just last year, they were, frankly, a model state and reported their results on time. So what flaws are states trying to address this year, and is it enough?
Well, it's a good question, Gordon. And you're right, Florida's kind of been the model for that, if you will. Look, there's a lot of different flaws, and Abby pointed some of them out, but let's start with voter identification. I mean, remember, Democrats believe that voter ID is voter suppression. We can get into that in a moment. But beyond all of that, you got voter drop boxes, certain places, left in parks, possibly unmanned, obviously, at times. Signature verification's been a big one. Mail-in balloting. So if you kind of look at it in totality, you've got two different versions here. You've got the Republicans saying, hey, we need to shore up election integrity. And you got the Democrats saying, well, hold on for a second. More rules and regulations means more voter suppression. And that's kind of been the big debate going on all along here, Gordon.
Well, I guess my casual observation, you ought to be able to require that there be an actual identification that this person has the right to vote and the right to vote in this precinct. That just seems to make sense to me. Why is that somehow voter suppression?
No, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, Democrats bring up this idea of folks that are low income, that don't have the necessary means to get a certain voter ID, but Republicans go, give me a break. I mean, it's not just about having a driver's license. There's all different types of voter ID that you can show, and it doesn't even mean a card. I mean, you can literally show a piece of paper that has your address on it or whatever you happen to be. So, look, I think that's been a big part of it. But I also think there's this big HR1 that we've heard about, right? This bill that Democrats have been wanting to pass. Really, it's their number one priority. They even say that. And the Republicans have been able to fight back against that because Democrats want to federalize elections. That's what they want to do with this bill. Republicans have been able to beat that back. And they say, of course, we can't federalize elections. And that's kind of been the bigger issue here in terms of how much, when you start to federalize elections, when you start to have more mail-in balloting, when you start to have more of a kind of an all-encompassing, for example, absentee voting, more absentee voting, you lose control of the process and you lose election integrity in the process.
Well, wasn't there a bipartisan commission that actually pointed that out, that one of the greatest abuses that could happen, I think no less than George Mitchell was on that panel, and they specifically pointed out mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting, where people can go and collect ballots and then put them in as a group, that those were the prime areas that you could have voter fraud.
Well, you're absolutely right, Gordon. I'm glad you brought that up. That was George Mitchell, a Democrat, James Baker, a Republican, putting out that study as the heads of the study that Republicans point to all the time and say, look, even a bipartisan study shows that this is not a good idea. You mentioned ballot harvesting real quick, and that is part of what the Democrats want is HR1, this federalizing of election. What do we mean by ballot harvesting? Just so we understand it here. Basically, you can just go and drop off a ballot at a local precinct or wherever it is of someone else's ballot. You can drop off someone else's ballot at a local precinct. Now, I will say that in California, that is legal. You can do that in the state of California. I believe it's one other state in the country, North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, also allows you to do that. But the Democrats want to do it federally, and the Republicans are like, wait a minute. We don't need the Wild West here, and that's what they think it'll be.
Well, I mean, the abuse from that is just obvious. Just imagine an employer saying, you have to turn in your ballot to me, and then I'll turn it in for you. Right. And if you want to continue getting a paycheck, this is how you're going to do it. The abuse is just painfully obvious. I don't understand, why would you want that kind of provision? Because that clearly can lead to strong-arm tactics.
Well, and it gets back to politics. I mean, Democrats are very good at this, and don't take my word for it. I mean, it's very well documented. It's something called granny farming. It's a form of ballot harvesting. In essence, going around to nursing homes, Democrat operatives going around to nursing homes and saying, to an 82-year-old in a nursing home, hey, here's some suggestions on how you might want to vote. And they go ahead and say, okay, just put my name down, and they sign away, and they bring the ballot in. That's what they do in California. It's called granny farming. It's a very interesting concept that is extremely controversial, and many people think immoral.
All right. Well, David, thanks for the analysis, and hopefully we won't federalize these rules, and we'll allow states to draft their own rules. That's been the pattern in the United States for a couple